The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain of the Afghan mountains as Master Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison adjusted his scope for the third time. Something felt wrong. The silence that had settled over their position wasn't the peaceful quiet of dawn. It was the heavy, oppressive silence that came before death. "Movement, 2 o'clock," whispered Petty Officer Second Class Danny Chun, his voice barely audible through the comm system. Morrison shifted his position slightly, scanning the rocky outcropping where Chun had indicated. The SEAL team had been in position for 6 hours, waiting for their target to emerge from the compound nestled in the valley below. Morrison's team consisted of 8 elite operators, each handpicked for this mission. Intelligence had indicated that a high-value target was meeting with local militia leaders in the compound. The mission was supposed to be straightforward: observe, identify, and eliminate. But as Morrison studied the landscape through his binoculars, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Chief, I've got eyes on at least 12 hostiles moving through the village," reported Petty Officer First Class Maria Santos from her overwatch position. Santos was their sniper, and her accuracy was legendary among the teams. If she said she saw 12, there were 12. They're armed and moving with purpose. Morrison processed the information quickly. 12 hostiles wasn't unusual for this type of operation, but their movement patterns suggested they knew something was happening. Either their intelligence had been compromised, or someone had spotted the team during their insertion. The compound sat in a natural bowl, surrounded by steep hills and rocky terrain. It was an ideal location for a defensive position, which was exactly why their target had chosen it. The only approaches were through narrow passes that could easily be defended by a small force. Morrison's team had spent weeks studying satellite imagery and drone footage to plan their infiltration route. "Delta 2, report." Morrison spoke into his mic, calling for updates from the team's demolitions expert, Petty Officer Second Class Alex Rodriguez. Rodriguez was positioned on the eastern ridge with a clear view of the compound's main entrance. "Chief, I'm seeing movement in the hills opposite our position," Rodriguez reported. "Could be shepherds, but they're moving in a coordinated pattern. Recommend we abort and extract." Morrison weighed his options. They had been tracking their target for months, and this was the first solid lead they'd had on his location. Aborting now would mean losing him again, possibly for months. But if their position was compromised, staying could mean walking into a trap. Negative on the abort, Morrison decided. "We maintain position and complete the mission. Stay alert and report any changes." As the sun climbed higher, the heat began to build on the rocky slope where the team lay concealed. Morrison could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. The waiting was always the hardest part of any operation. Training prepared you for action, but it was the long hours of motionless observation that tested an operator's mental discipline. Petty Officer Third Class Tommy Williams, their communications specialist, shifted slightly beside Morrison. Williams was young, only 24, but he had proven himself in 2 previous deployments. His ability to maintain communication links in the most challenging environments had saved the team on more than one occasion. "Chief, I'm picking up radio chatter," Williams whispered. "Multiple frequencies, coordinated movement. They know we're here." Morrison felt his stomach tighten. If the enemy knew their position, the mission had just become exponentially more dangerous. They were 8 operators against an unknown number of hostiles who had the advantage of local terrain knowledge and defensive positions. "All units, prepare for immediate extraction," Morrison ordered, his training taking over. "Williams, call for extraction. Santos, cover our withdrawal. Chun and Rodriguez, watch our 6. But before Williams could establish contact with their extraction team, the first shot rang out. The bullet struck the rock inches from Morrison's head, sending sharp fragments across his face. The crack of the rifle echoed through the valley, followed immediately by the distinctive whistle of incoming rounds from multiple directions. "Contact! Contact!" Morrison shouted into his mic as his team immediately began returning fire. "We're taking fire from multiple positions." Santos had already shifted into firing position and was scanning for targets through her scope. "I count at least 6 muzzle flashes from the northern ridge," she reported calmly, despite the chaos erupting around them. "Range approximately 800 meters. Morrison rolled behind a larger boulder as rounds continued to impact around their position. The enemy had clearly been planning this ambush for some time. Their firing positions were well concealed and provided overlapping fields of fire that made movement extremely dangerous. "Rodriguez, can you get eyes on our primary exit route?" Morrison called out. "Negative, Chief. They got the main path covered. I can see at least 4 positions with clear sight lines on our planned extraction point." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Not only were they pinned down by accurate sniper fire, but their planned escape route was compromised. Morrison began running through alternatives in his mind, but each option seemed to lead them into another killing field. Chun, who had been monitoring the radio frequencies, suddenly looked up with alarm. "Chief, I'm hearing vehicles approaching from the south. Sounds like at least 2 trucks, maybe more." Morrison cursed under his breath. Vehicles meant reinforcements, and reinforcements meant they would soon be facing overwhelming numbers. The mission had gone from complicated to desperate in a matter of minutes. "Williams, where's our extraction?" Morrison demanded. "Working on it, Chief, but the radio's being jammed. I can't get through to base." As if the situation couldn't get worse, Morrison realized they were not only pinned down and outnumbered, but they were also cut off from support. The enemy had planned this ambush carefully, using electronic warfare to isolate the team. Santos continued to engage targets as they appeared, her rifle cracking steadily as she attempted to suppress the enemy snipers. But for every muzzle flash she engaged, 2 more seemed to appear from different positions. "Chief, we need to move now," Rodriguez called out. "I can see dust clouds from multiple directions. We're about to be surrounded." Morrison studied the terrain around their position. They were on a rocky slope with minimal cover, facing an enemy force that seemed to know exactly where they were and how they would attempt to escape. Traditional military tactics suggested they should attempt to break contact and withdraw, but every available route was covered by enemy fire. It was then that Morrison noticed something that had been bothering him since the shooting started. The enemy fire was accurate and coordinated, suggesting professional training rather than the usual militia forces they encountered. The positioning of the sniper nest indicated advanced tactical knowledge and careful planning. "Santos, what's your assessment of the enemy shooters?" Morrison asked. "Professional grade, Chief. Clean shots, good positioning, coordinated fire. These aren't local militia." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. If they were facing professional soldiers or mercenaries rather than local fighters, the situation was even more serious than he had initially thought. Professional soldiers would be better equipped, better trained, and more likely to have additional resources available. The sound of approaching vehicles was getting louder, and Morrison could now make out the distinct rumble of heavy trucks struggling up the mountain roads. Whatever reinforcements were coming, they would arrive within minutes. "All units, prepare for a fighting withdrawal," Morrison ordered. "We move in pairs, covering each other. Santos, you stay in overwatch as long as possible, then follow when we reach the secondary position." "Roger that, Chief. I'll keep their heads down as long as I can." Morrison signaled to Chun and Williams to prepare to move. The plan was simple: bound from cover to cover until they reached a position where they could establish a new defensive line or find an alternative escape route. It was dangerous and would require perfect timing and coordination, but staying in their current position would eventually result in their being overrun. "On my mark," Morrison whispered into his mic, 3 to a move. Chun and Williams sprinted from their concealed positions toward a cluster of rocks about 50 meters down the slope. Santos immediately began engaging any enemy position that tried to target them, her rifle speaking with deadly precision. The movement drew immediate fire from the enemy snipers. Rounds cracked through the air around the running seals, striking rocks and sending up clouds of dust and debris. But Santos' suppressive fire was effective, forcing the enemy shooters to take cover rather than aim carefully. Chun and Williams reached their new position safely and immediately began providing covering fire for the next pair. Morrison and Rodriguez prepared to make the same dangerous dash across the open ground. But as Morrison prepared to give the signal for their movement, Williams' voice came through his earpiece with an urgency that made his blood run cold. "Chief, we've got a problem. I'm seeing movement in the valley behind us. Looks like they've got people moving up from our insertion point. We're being surrounded." Morrison felt the tactical situation collapse around him like a house of cards. Not only were they pinned down by accurate sniper fire and facing incoming reinforcements, but the enemy was also moving to cut off their escape routes. They were being systematically trapped in a killing field with no apparent way out. The sound of the approaching vehicles was now clearly audible, accompanied by the distant shouts of men moving through the rocky terrain. Morrison estimated they had perhaps 10 minutes before the enemy reinforcements arrived in strength. "All units, new plan," Morrison broadcast. "We hold this position and fight. Williams, keep trying to reach extraction. Santos, prioritize any target that looks like a leader or a communication specialist." As Morrison settled behind his cover and checked his ammunition, he couldn't help but think about the families back home who were counting on his team to return safely. 8 highly trained operators were about to face odds that would challenge even their elite capabilities. The mountain air that had seemed so peaceful just hours earlier now carried the acrid smell of gunpowder and the sound of men preparing to fight for their lives. Morrison gripped his rifle tighter and prepared for what might be his final battle, unaware that salvation would come from the most unexpected source imaginable. The first enemy vehicle appeared on the road below, followed quickly by a second truck loaded with armed men. Morrison could see the enemy forces beginning to coordinate their assault, setting up positions that would allow them to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. But in the midst of this desperate situation, something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that none of them, neither the surrounded SEALs nor their enemies, could possibly have anticipated. 2 kilometers away from where Master Chief Morrison and his team fought for their lives, Dr. Sarah Chun moved through the mountain terrain with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning to become invisible. She wasn't related to Petty Officer Danny Chun. The similarity in names was pure coincidence, but what she shared with the pinned-down SEALs was a deep understanding of what it meant to serve in harm's way. Sarah had been in Afghanistan for 18 months, officially working as a medical researcher studying the effects of high-altitude environments on combat stress. Unofficially, she possessed skills that made her invaluable to special operations units operating in the region. Skills that she had never put on any resume and that very few people knew existed. At 32, Sarah appeared unremarkable to casual observation. Average height, brown hair typically pulled back in a practical ponytail, and clothes chosen for function rather than fashion. But beneath this ordinary exterior was someone who had spent 15 years studying the art of remaining unseen and unheard. Her father had been a Marine sniper in Vietnam, and he had begun teaching her woodcraft and marksmanship when she was barely old enough to hold a rifle. The sound of gunfire echoing through the valley had reached her position at the medical research station nearly 20 minutes earlier. Sarah had immediately recognized the distinctive crack of military-grade rifles and the coordinated pattern of suppressive fire. Someone was in serious trouble, and given the location, it was almost certainly American forces. She had tried to reach the base on her satellite phone, but the communications were being jammed. Whatever was happening in the valley was serious enough that someone was employing electronic warfare to prevent calls for help. Sarah made her decision quickly. She gathered her medical kit, checked her personal equipment, and began moving toward the sound of the fighting. Her official position as a civilian researcher meant she should have stayed put and waited for instructions. But Sarah had never been good at following orders when people were dying. Moving through the rocky terrain toward the gunfire required every skill her father had taught her. The mountains of Afghanistan were unforgiving to those who moved carelessly. Loose rocks could trigger avalanches, and the thin air at altitude made physical exertion dangerous for those not accustomed to it. But Sarah had spent months in these mountains, and her body had adapted to the challenges. As she drew closer to the firefight, Sarah began to assess the tactical situation. The sound pattern suggested that a small force was engaged with a much larger enemy group. The American weapons had a distinctive sound signature that she recognized from her time, embedded with various units. But the enemy fire was coming from multiple directions, indicating that the Americans were surrounded or nearly so. Sarah reached a ridge overlooking the valley where the battle was taking place and carefully positioned herself to observe without being seen. What she saw below made her heart sink. 8 men in American military gear were pinned down on an exposed slope, taking fire from at least 6 different positions. Enemy trucks were disgorging additional fighters, and she could see movement in the hills that suggested the Americans' escape routes were being systematically cut off. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see the precise positioning of the enemy sniper nests. Whoever had planned this ambush knew exactly what they were doing. The Americans were caught in a carefully orchestrated trap with overlapping fields of fire that made movement extremely dangerous. But Sarah noticed something that the trapped Americans couldn't see from their position. The enemy snipers had positioned themselves to cover the obvious escape routes and to maintain sight lines on the Americans' current position. However, their positioning also created blind spots that could be exploited by someone approaching from the right angle. Sarah studied the enemy positions carefully, noting the range and sight lines from each location. Her father's training had included not just marksmanship, but also the tactical analysis that allowed snipers to be effective on the battlefield. She could see the pattern in how the enemy had positioned themselves, and, more importantly, she could see their weaknesses. The enemy snipers had made one crucial mistake in their positioning. They had focused so intently on covering the Americans' position and escape routes that they had left themselves vulnerable to attack from the higher elevations behind their positions. The terrain that made their sniper nests effective also provided concealed approaches for someone who knew how to use the ground to their advantage. Sarah began moving again, this time with a specific purpose. Her medical kit would have to wait. Right now, she needed different tools. From her pack, she withdrew items that weren't standard medical equipment. A suppressed rifle that she carried for protection against wildlife, a rangefinder, and a small notebook where she began calculating distances and wind conditions. The suppressed rifle was a custom-built weapon that her father had given her when she deployed. Officially, it was for protection against wild animals that might threaten the research station. Unofficially, it was a precision instrument capable of making accurate shots at extended ranges with minimal noise signature. Sarah had been reluctant to carry the weapon initially, preferring to rely on her medical training and research work. But months in the harsh environment had taught her that sometimes the only way to save lives was to take them. The suppressor would mask the sound and muzzle flash of her shots, making it difficult for the enemy to locate her position. Moving to her first target required a careful approach through terrain that provided concealment, but also allowed her to establish a clear line of sight. Sarah chose a sniper position that was approximately 400 meters from the nearest enemy nest and began her approach. The climb to her chosen position was treacherous. The rocks were loose and unstable, requiring careful placement of each step to avoid creating noise or triggering a rock slide. Sarah moved slowly and deliberately, testing each handhold before committing her weight to it. The thin mountain air made the physical exertion challenging, but her conditioning from months of research work at altitude served her well. As she climbed, Sarah could hear the ongoing firefight below. The Americans were still returning fire, but she could tell from the sound patterns that they were conserving ammunition. That suggested they were running low on supplies and couldn't maintain their current rate of fire indefinitely. The first enemy sniper position came into view as Sarah reached her firing position. Through her scope, she could see a man in military fatigues positioned behind a natural rock wall with his rifle trained on the American position. His weapon appeared to be a professionally maintained military rifle, confirming Santos' assessment that these weren't local militia fighters. Sarah studied the target carefully, noting his position, his field of fire, and his apparent level of training. The man was lying prone behind cover with only his head and shoulders exposed, presenting a difficult target even for an experienced marksman. But his positioning also indicated that he was focused entirely on the Americans below and wasn't watching for threats from other directions. The range to target was 347 meters according to her rangefinder. Sarah made mental calculations for bullet drop, wind drift, and the effects of the high altitude on her ammunition's performance. The morning air was still, which would help with accuracy, but the angle of the shot was slightly downhill, which would affect the bullet's trajectory. Sarah settled into her firing position and controlled her breathing. Her father had taught her that the most important part of any shot wasn't the trigger pull. It was the mental preparation that preceded it. The target had to be clearly identified, the shot had to be necessary, and the marksman had to be completely committed to the action. Looking through her scope, Sarah could see that the enemy sniper was actively engaging the American position. Muzzle flashes from his rifle indicated he was firing aimed shots at specific targets. Every round he fired increased the danger to the men trapped below. Sarah made her final adjustments and took up trigger pressure. The crosshairs settled on the target's center mass, accounting for the slight wind and the downhill angle. She exhaled halfway and held her breath, allowing her heartbeat to slow and her body to settle into perfect stillness. The suppressed rifle spoke with a soft cough that was immediately absorbed by the mountain air. Through her scope, Sarah saw the target jerk and slump forward, his rifle falling silent. The first threat had been eliminated, but there were at least 5 more positions that needed to be dealt with. Sarah immediately began moving to her next firing position. Staying in one location after taking a shot was a basic mistake that could get her killed. Even with the suppressor, there was still some sound and muzzle flash that could potentially be detected by an alert enemy. The second enemy position was located on a ridge approximately 250 meters from her first target. This sniper had positioned himself with a clear view of the Americans' planned escape route, making him a high-priority target. But his position was also more challenging to approach without being detected. As Sarah moved toward her next firing position, she could see the effect of her first shot on the tactical situation below. The Americans were beginning to move, taking advantage of the reduced enemy fire to reposition themselves. But they were still taking accurate fire from the remaining sniper positions. The second approach required Sarah to cross a section of open ground that was visible from several enemy positions. She waited for a moment when the other snipers were engaged in firing at the Americans, then moved quickly across the exposed area using the terrain features to mask her movement. The physical demands of moving rapidly through the thin mountain air while carrying equipment were significant. Sarah could feel her heart rate climbing and her breathing becoming labored. But she pushed through the discomfort, knowing that speed was essential to maintaining the element of surprise. Reaching her second firing position, Sarah could see that this sniper was using a different type of weapon, a heavier rifle with a larger scope that suggested he was the designated long-range specialist among the enemy force. His position was well constructed with prepared firing lanes and good concealment. This target was more alert than the first, occasionally scanning different areas rather than focusing solely on the American position. Sarah would have to time her shot carefully to avoid being detected before she could engage. She settled into position and began her target analysis. The range was 298 meters, with a slight crosswind that would require compensation. The target was positioned behind a rock formation that provided excellent cover, but also limited his mobility. Once she fired, he would have difficulty changing positions quickly. Sarah waited for the right moment, watching the target's pattern of movement and engagement. When he turned to fire at the American position, presenting his profile, she took the shot. The second enemy sniper dropped immediately, his weapon falling silent. But this time, Sarah noticed that one of the other enemy positions seemed to be reacting to something. Either they had detected her shot, or they had noticed that their companion had stopped firing. Time was becoming a critical factor. The longer she spent engaging individual targets, the more likely it became that the enemy would detect her presence and begin actively hunting for her. But the American forces below were still pinned down by accurate fire from the remaining positions. Sarah began moving toward her third target, but she could already see that this engagement would be different. The enemy was becoming aware that something was happening to their sniper positions, and they were starting to adjust their tactics accordingly. As she approached the third firing position, Sarah could see enemy fighters beginning to move through the valley below. Some were repositioning to establish new firing positions, while others appeared to be conducting a search pattern in the hills where she was operating. The hunt was becoming mutual. While Sarah stalked the remaining enemy snipers, they were beginning to realize they were being stalked in return. The tactical situation was evolving rapidly, and Sarah would need to adapt her approach to maintain her effectiveness while avoiding detection. Looking down at the trapped American forces, Sarah could see that they were running out of time. The enemy reinforcements had arrived, and were beginning to coordinate an assault on the American position. If she couldn't eliminate the remaining sniper threats quickly, the 8 men below would be overrun regardless of her efforts. Sarah checked her ammunition and prepared for the most dangerous phase of her mission. The remaining enemy snipers would be alert and actively searching for threats. Each subsequent engagement would be more difficult and more dangerous than the last. But as she moved toward her next target, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that 8 men's lives depended on her ability to remain invisible while eliminating threats that had years of professional military training. The odds were against her, but sometimes being underestimated was the greatest advantage of all. The third enemy sniper position proved to be the most challenging target Sarah had encountered. Located on a rocky outcrop that provided commanding views of the entire valley, the sniper had positioned himself with multiple escape routes and excellent cover. More concerning was the fact that he seemed to be the leader of the sniper team, based on the radio equipment visible near his position. Sarah observed the target through her scope from a concealed position approximately 450 meters away. This sniper was different from the others, more careful, more professional in his movements, and clearly more experienced. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had survived many battles by being smarter and more cautious than his enemies. While she studied her target, Sarah could hear the ongoing firefight below intensifying. The American forces had managed to reposition slightly, but they were still effectively pinned down. The arrival of enemy reinforcements had added new complications to their situation, and Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple new positions as the enemy began coordinating their assault. Master Chief Morrison's voice occasionally carried across the valley as he directed his team's defensive efforts. Sarah could tell from the urgency in his commands that the Americans were running low on ammunition and options. Time was becoming the most critical factor in the engagement. The enemy sniper leader was using hand signals to coordinate with other positions, confirming Sarah's assessment that he was directing the sniper team's efforts. Eliminating him would disrupt their coordination and potentially create confusion among the remaining shooters. But approaching his position would require crossing approximately 200 meters of terrain that offered minimal concealment. Worse, Sarah had noticed that at least one of the remaining snipers seemed to be scanning the hills systematically, searching for the threat that had eliminated his teammates. Sarah made a tactical decision that went against her every instinct for self-preservation. Instead of taking the safe approach, she would move rapidly across the exposed terrain and rely on speed rather than concealment to reach an effective firing position. The dash across the open ground required every bit of conditioning Sarah had developed during her months in the mountains. The thin air made her lungs burn as she sprinted between scattered boulders, using every available piece of cover to break up her movement profile. Halfway across the exposed area, Sarah heard the distinctive crack of a rifle bullet passing close to her position. One of the enemy snipers had detected her movement and was attempting to engage her. She dove behind a cluster of rocks as more rounds struck the ground around her position. From her new cover, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 2 enemy positions that were now actively searching for her. The element of surprise that had protected her during her first 2 engagements was gone. From this point forward, she would be in a direct firefight with professionally trained snipers who knew she was hunting them. Sarah assessed her situation quickly. She was pinned down by accurate rifle fire, approximately 300 meters from her intended target, with limited cover and escape routes. The smart tactical decision would be to withdraw and attempt to reach the American position to reinforce their defense. But looking down at the valley, Sarah could see that the American situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy forces were moving to surround their position, and the coordinated sniper fire was preventing them from maneuvering effectively. If she withdrew now, the 8 men below would almost certainly be overrun, making a decision that her father would have called either brilliant or suicidal. Sarah began moving again. But this time, instead of trying to reach the sniper leader's position, she began working her way toward the nearest enemy sniper who was actively engaging her. The counterattack required Sarah to use every lesson her father had taught her about combat movement in mountainous terrain. She moved in short rushes between cover points, never staying exposed for more than a few seconds at a time. The enemy sniper was experienced, but he was also focused on searching for her in the area where she had last been seen. Sarah's flanking movement took her along a narrow ledge that provided concealment from the sniper's position, but required careful movement to avoid falling. The drop below the ledge was steep enough that a fall would be fatal, but it also meant that the enemy wouldn't expect an attack from that direction. As she moved along the ledge, Sarah could hear radio chatter from the enemy positions. Although she couldn't understand the language, the urgency in the voices suggested that the elimination of 2 snipers had created confusion and concern among their forces. The flanking approach brought Sarah to within 150 meters of her target's position. From this distance, she could see the enemy sniper clearly through her scope. He was systematically searching the area where she had been pinned down, unaware that she had moved to a position behind and above his location. This sniper was using a high-quality military rifle with professional-grade optics. His equipment and positioning indicated advanced training and significant combat experience. But his focus on the search had made him predictable in his movements, providing Sarah with the opportunity she needed. Sarah settled into a stable firing position and began her shot preparation. The target was partially concealed behind rocky cover, presenting only his head and shoulders for a potential shot. The angle was awkward, requiring her to fire from an uncomfortable position that made precise shot placement more difficult. The range was 147 meters according to her rangefinder. At this distance, the effects of wind and altitude would be minimal, but the target's partial concealment meant that shot placement would need to be perfect. A wounded enemy sniper would be more dangerous than an alert one. Sarah controlled her breathing and settled the crosshairs on the visible portion of her target. The enemy sniper shifted position slightly, presenting a clearer shot opportunity. Sarah took up trigger pressure and fired. The suppressed rifle's report was absorbed by the mountain air, but the effect was immediate. The third enemy sniper slumped forward, his rifle falling silent. But Sarah's position was immediately compromised as rocky debris from her muzzle blast scattered down the cliff face. Enemy voices began shouting, and Sarah could see movement from multiple positions as the remaining snipers attempted to locate her firing position. She had perhaps 30 seconds before accurate fire began impacting her location. Sarah began moving immediately, abandoning her position and heading toward her next target. But the terrain that had provided concealment for her approach now became a liability as she attempted to escape. The narrow ledge that had hidden her movement now limited her escape options. Rifle bullets began striking the cliff face around her position as the remaining enemy snipers attempted to suppress her movement. Sarah could tell from the sound of the impacts that at least two different weapons were engaging her, suggesting that the surviving snipers were coordinating their efforts to trap her. The fourth enemy position was located on a ridge approximately 400 meters from Sarah's current location. Reaching it would require crossing another section of exposed ground while under direct fire from multiple enemy positions. But Sarah could see that this sniper was positioned to cover the American forces' most likely escape route. Looking down at the valley, Sarah could see that the American situation had become critical. Enemy forces were advancing on their position from multiple directions, and the Americans were being forced to fall back to an even more exposed position. Master Chief Morrison was attempting to coordinate a fighting withdrawal, but the accurate sniper fire was making movement extremely dangerous. Sarah made another decision that prioritized the American survival over her own safety. Instead of taking the time to carefully approach the fourth sniper position, she would attempt a long-range shot from her current location. The shot would be at the absolute limit of her weapon's effective range and would require perfect compensation for wind, altitude, and the steep downhill angle. Worse, taking the shot would reveal her exact position to any remaining enemy forces, making escape extremely difficult. But Sarah could see that time was running out for the men below. The enemy assault was reaching its climax, and the Americans would be overrun within minutes if the sniper fire wasn't eliminated. Sarah found the most stable firing position available given her precarious location on the cliff face. The fourth enemy sniper was clearly visible through her scope, positioned behind prepared cover with an excellent field of fire. He was actively engaging the American position, his muzzle flashes indicating regular aimed fire. The range to target was 390 meters with a significant downhill angle that would affect bullet trajectory. A crosswind had picked up, adding another variable to the shot calculation. Sarah had one opportunity to make the shot before enemy fire would force her to move. She settled into position and began her final shot preparation. The crosshairs wavered slightly in the wind, requiring her to time the shot for a moment of stability. The target moved regularly between different firing positions, presenting brief opportunities for a clear shot. Sarah waited for the right moment, controlling her breathing despite the physical stress of her position. When the enemy sniper settled into his firing position and presented a clear profile, she took the shot. The bullet struck true, eliminating the fourth enemy sniper immediately. But the muzzle flash from Sarah's position was immediately spotted by the remaining enemy forces, and accurate fire began impacting her location within seconds. Sarah was forced to move immediately, abandoning her position as rifle bullets shattered the rocks around her. She could hear enemy voices shouting coordinates, indicating that her position had been accurately identified and communicated to multiple shooters. The descent from the cliff position required Sarah to move as quickly as possible while maintaining enough control to avoid a fatal fall. Enemy bullets continued to strike around her as she rappelled down the rock face using climbing technique her father had taught her years earlier. But as Sarah reached the bottom of the cliff, she realized that her tactical situation had fundamentally changed. She was no longer the hunter. She had become the hunted. The remaining enemy snipers knew approximately where she was, and they were actively coordinating to eliminate her. Looking toward the valley, Sarah could see that her efforts had created an opportunity for the American forces. With 4 of the 6 sniper positions eliminated, Master Chief Morrison was beginning to coordinate a breakout attempt. But 2 enemy snipers remained, and they were now focused as much on hunting Sarah as on maintaining pressure on the Americans. Sarah checked her ammunition and prepared for the final phase of her mission. She had perhaps 20 rounds remaining, facing at least 2 professional snipers who were actively hunting her in terrain they knew better than she did. But the Americans below were beginning to move, taking advantage of the reduced sniper fire to attempt their escape. Sarah's efforts had created a window of opportunity, but that window would close quickly if she couldn't eliminate the remaining threats. As enemy voices echoed through the valley and rifle bullets continued to search for her position, Sarah prepared for the most dangerous phase of her mission. The remaining enemy snipers would be alert, coordinated, and determined to eliminate the threat that had systematically destroyed their team. But Sarah carried with her something more than just training and equipment. She carried the knowledge that 8 American servicemen were counting on her ability to remain invisible while eliminating threats that wanted nothing more than to see her dead. The hunt was far from over, but Sarah had already proven that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one you never see coming. Sarah's escape from the cliff position brought her into a rocky drainage that provided temporary concealment, but also channeled her movement in a predictable direction. She could hear the remaining enemy snipers coordinating their search through radio communications that echoed off the valley walls. They were systematically working to trap her in the terrain features that had initially provided her with advantages. Master Chief Morrison's voice carried across the valley as he attempted to coordinate his team's breakout. Sarah could see the Americans beginning to move from their pinned position, using the reduced sniper fire to advance toward what appeared to be their planned extraction point. But their movement was still being hampered by accurate fire from the 2 remaining enemy positions. The 5th enemy sniper had positioned himself in a location that commanded both Sarah's likely escape routes and the Americans' movement corridor. His position was professionally selected to maximize tactical advantage while minimizing exposure to counterfire. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from his location as he alternated between engaging the American forces and searching for her position. The 6th sniper remained hidden, his position unknown, but his presence confirmed by the coordinated radio traffic Sarah could overhear. This unknown threat was perhaps the most dangerous because Sarah couldn't predict his field of fire or his likely reaction to her movements. Sarah realized that her tactical situation required a fundamental change in approach. The methodical elimination of enemy positions that had worked for her first 4 targets was no longer viable. The remaining snipers were actively hunting her, and they had the advantage of coordinated communications and superior knowledge of the local terrain. Looking at the American forces movement, Sarah could see that they were making progress toward their extraction point, but were still taking casualties from the accurate sniper fire. Petty Officer Santos appeared to be wounded, supported by 2 other team members as they moved between cover positions. The Americans needed the remaining sniper threats eliminated quickly, or their escape attempt would fail. Sarah made a decision that went against every principle of sniper warfare her father had taught her. Instead of continuing to hunt the enemy snipers individually, she would attempt to draw them into engaging her simultaneously, creating an opportunity to eliminate both threats in rapid succession. The plan required Sarah to expose herself in a position where both remaining snipers could engage her, then use their muzzle flashes to locate their exact positions for counterfire. The risk was enormous. She would be facing 2 professional snipers simultaneously with no cover and limited ammunition. But Sarah could see that the American breakout was failing. Enemy reinforcements were moving to cut off their escape route, and the accurate sniper fire was preventing them from moving with the speed necessary for a successful extraction. If she didn't eliminate the remaining threats within the next few minutes, all 8 men would be killed or captured. Sarah began moving toward a rocky knoll that would provide her with visibility of the entire valley while offering minimal concealment. The position would make her visible to any enemy forces in the area, but it would also allow her to engage multiple targets simultaneously. The movement to the exposed position required Sarah to cross approximately 300 meters of terrain that offered minimal cover. She moved in short rushes between scattered boulders, expecting enemy fire to begin impacting her position at any moment. But the enemy snipers seemed to be focusing on the American forces rather than actively searching for her. Their radio communications suggested they were receiving orders to prevent the American escape at all costs, even if it meant allowing Sarah to remain at large temporarily. As Sarah reached her chosen position, she could see the tactical situation developing in the valley below. The Americans had advanced to within 200 meters of their extraction point, but enemy forces were moving to intercept them. The remaining sniper fire was forcing them to move slowly and carefully, preventing them from reaching safety before being cut off. From her elevated position, Sarah could finally see both remaining enemy sniper positions clearly. The fifth sniper was located on a ridge approximately 350 meters to her north, while the sixth had positioned himself in a rocky outcrop 280 meters to the east. Both positions offered excellent fields of fire and good concealment, but they also presented clear target opportunities for someone with the right angle and equipment. Sarah settled into her firing position and began calculating shots for both targets. The ranges and angles were different enough that she would need to make significant adjustments between engagements. More challenging was the fact that firing at either target would immediately reveal her position to the other, creating a deadly race to see who could acquire and engage their target first. The wind had picked up significantly, adding another variable to her shot calculations. Sarah estimated the wind speed at approximately 8 miles per hour from the northwest, which would affect bullet trajectory differently for each target based on their relative positions. Sarah made her decision about target priority based on the immediate threat to the American forces. The fifth sniper was actively engaging the Americans and appeared to be causing the most difficulty for their movement. Eliminating him first would provide immediate relief for the breakout attempt, even though it would expose her to fire from the sixth position. She settled her crosshairs on the fifth target and began her shot preparation. The enemy sniper was partially concealed behind rocky cover, presenting only his head and shoulders for a potential shot. The range was 347 meters, with a significant crosswind that required compensation. Sarah controlled her breathing and waited for the right moment to take the shot. The enemy sniper was actively engaging the American position, his regular muzzle flashes indicating steady aimed fire. When he settled into a stable firing position, Sarah took her shot. The suppressed rifle spoke, and the fifth enemy sniper immediately slumped forward. But Sarah's muzzle flash was instantly detected by the sixth sniper, who began engaging her position immediately. Sarah heard the distinctive crack of a high-velocity bullet passing close to her head as she rolled to acquire her second target. The sixth sniper was using a different weapon than the others, something with more power and a faster muzzle velocity that suggested a precision long-range rifle. Through her scope, Sarah could see the sixth sniper clearly for the first time. He was older than the others, with the steady movements of someone with extensive combat experience. His equipment was also superior, professional-grade optics, and what appeared to be a custom-built rifle designed for precision shooting at extended ranges. The range to the sixth target was 284 meters with the wind, now coming from a slightly different angle. Sarah had perhaps 3 seconds before the enemy sniper's next shot, which would be more accurate now that he had established her location. Sarah settled her crosshairs and fired without the careful preparation she had used for previous shots. The situation demanded speed over perfection, and hesitation would be fatal. Her bullet struck the sixth sniper center mass, eliminating the final threat to the American forces. But as Sarah began to move from her exposed position, she heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of additional vehicles approaching the valley from multiple directions. Looking down at the American position, Sarah could see that Master Chief Morrison had successfully led his team to within 50 meters of their extraction point. But enemy reinforcements were arriving faster than anticipated, and the Americans were about to be cut off despite her success in eliminating the sniper threats. Sarah realized that her mission wasn't complete. Even though she had eliminated all 6 enemy snipers, the American forces were still in danger of being overrun by the arriving reinforcements. She had perhaps 10 minutes before the enemy forces would be positioned to prevent any possibility of extraction, making a decision that her training as a medical researcher would never have prepared her for. Sarah began moving toward the valley floor. If the Americans were going to escape, they would need additional firepower to fight through the enemy reinforcements. The descent from her elevated position required careful movement to avoid triggering rock slides that would reveal her location. Sarah could see enemy forces moving through the valley below, but they appear to be focused on intercepting the American forces rather than searching for additional threats. As she approached the American position, Sarah could see the team's tactical situation clearly. They were well-trained and well-led, but they were running low on ammunition and had at least one wounded team member who was slowing their movement. The enemy reinforcements would intercept them before they could reach their extraction point. Sarah approached the American position carefully, using hand signals and identification protocols her father had taught her to avoid being mistaken for an enemy combatant. When she was within voice range, she called out using standard military challenge and response procedures. American forces, this is Dr. Sarah Chun, medical researcher. I'm approaching from your 6 o'clock position with medical supplies and additional ammunition. Master Chief Morrison's voice responded immediately. Dr. Chun, identify yourself with current challenge codes. Sarah provided the authentication information she had been given as part of her research assignment security briefing. Morrison's response indicated acceptance, and Sarah was able to approach the American position safely. What she found was exactly what she had expected: 8 highly trained operators who were running low on supplies and dealing with a wounded team member. Petty Officer Santos had taken a rifle bullet through her shoulder and was losing blood steadily despite field dressings applied by her teammates. "Ma'am, we need immediate extraction," Morrison told her. "Enemy reinforcements are moving to cut off our escape route, and we don't have the ammunition for a sustained firefight." Sarah quickly assessed Santos' wound and began applying proper medical treatment. The bullet had passed through muscle tissue without hitting major blood vessels, but Santos was in shock and would need immediate medical attention once they reached safety. "Chief, I've been observing the enemy movement patterns," Sarah told Morrison while working on Santos. "They're moving to cut off your primary extraction route, but there's an alternative path through the eastern ridge that they haven't covered yet." Morrison studied the terrain Sarah indicated. "That route takes us through some rough ground. With a wounded team member, we might not be able to move fast enough. I can provide covering fire while you move," Sarah offered. "I've got ammunition and a clear field of fire from multiple positions along that route." Morrison looked at Sarah with new understanding. "Ma'am, how exactly does a medical researcher know about providing covering fire and alternative escape routes?" "My father was a Marine sniper," Sarah replied simply. "He taught me a few things that aren't in medical school curricula." Morrison made his tactical decision quickly. "All right, document. If you can get us to that eastern ridge, we can make it to the secondary extraction point." Sarah finished treating Santos and helped Morrison organize the team's movement. The alternative escape route would be more difficult, but would avoid the enemy forces moving to intercept them on the primary path. As the team prepared to move, Sarah took a moment to contact the base using Morrison's communication equipment. The jamming had apparently ended with the elimination of the enemy snipers, allowing her to request immediate medical evacuation for Santos and extraction support for the entire team. The movement to the eastern ridge required coordinated teamwork between Sarah and the American forces. She provided covering fire from elevated positions while the team moved between cover points, using her knowledge of the enemy elimination to ensure their route remained clear. 2 hours later, Sarah found herself aboard a military helicopter flying toward the main American base in the region. Santos was stable and receiving 4 fluids, while the rest of Morrison's team was safely extracted without additional casualties. As the helicopter flew over the valley where the battle had taken place, Sarah could see enemy forces still searching the area for threats they would never find. The 6 sniper positions she had eliminated were clearly visible from the air, demonstrating the complexity of the trap that had been laid for Morrison's team. Morrison approached Sarah as the helicopter neared the base. "Dr. Chun, I need to ask you something. Those weren't lucky shots you made today. That was professional-level precision shooting under combat conditions." Sarah looked out at the mountains passing below them. "Chief, sometimes being invisible is the most important skill you can have. My father taught me that the best way to save lives is sometimes to take them. Today, 8 lives were more important than 6. Morrison nodded with understanding. Ma'am, on behalf of my team, thank you. We owe you our lives. As the helicopter touched down at the base, Sarah gathered her medical equipment and prepared to return to her research station. Officially, she had been conducting high-altitude medical research when she heard gunfire and responded to provide medical assistance. The details of exactly what happened in the mountains would be classified at levels far above her security clearance. But Sarah knew that somewhere in the Pentagon, analysts would study the tactical details of the engagement and wonder how 6 professional snipers have been eliminated by an unknown force without ever detecting their attacker. The mystery would become part of special operations folklore, a story told to remind operators that the most dangerous threats were often the ones you never saw coming. Walking across the base, toward her transportation back to the research station, Sarah reflected on the lessons her father had taught her about service and sacrifice. Sometimes protecting those who serve requires skills that aren't found in any official training manual. Sometimes being invisible means being willing to step out of the shadows when lives hang in the balance. The mountains of Afghanistan would keep their secrets, but 8 American servicemen would return home safely to their families. For Sarah, that knowledge was worth every risk she had taken in the thin mountain air, where precision and courage had made all the difference between life and death.